Call me, D.
As the end of the year approached, Rakie was still attending school and was already considered violent by the school staff, but he kicked it up a notch because now they were saying he acted more than violent. He had a pattern of disruptive behavior and was very aggressive, and they thought that because Rakie had fallen behind his classmates that it may have contributed to his volatile pattern. So even in the face of destruction, there were folks still wanting to help this kid. But a few miles away at the police station, Detective Woody began noticing Rakie's name appearing more and more on a flowchart that kept up with the city's homicides, with one column showing names of the victims, the next column with primary suspects who were identified by informants, then the third which had the names of individuals who weren't the trigger man but thought they may be involved. And at first, Rakie's name was almost always in the last column as a person who witnessed or had a hand in a murder. But then his name began appearing as a primary suspect. The brief timeline showed how quickly Rakie climbed the ranks by first joining what police called a gang. But to the streets of Richmond, the gang thing was never an accurate description of who we were. Now, who you with can be heavily based on your last name, which means the family bloodline you come from, and the individuals who's close with said family. Far as what you represent would be the neighborhood you grew up in, or what side of the city you live on. So after Rakie's alleged initiation, it wasn't long before he became a shooter. Then lastly, that shooter would become a hitman after displaying how fearless he was. The Johnson Brown gang would take him on a few hits, and you could say it was a street version of an officer's ride-along. But this development with Rakie seemed to happen within 1 year. Now Rakie would thankfully see another birthday that September of '86, turning 16 years old. And in the very next month, he left John F. Kennedy High School for good. It said that Rakie had dropped out, but school officials reported he was actually suspended because he missed school so often. And when he did attend, every teacher having the honor to supervise him had a hard time controlling and disciplining him. If that wasn't enough to say that Rakie was working this bad behavior streak, he would also beat his mother in the same month of him leaving school, which would be a lot worse than the first time he raised his hand at his mom just a year ago. So his mother Barbara then went to the police, and the complaint she filed says verbatim, he beat her with his fists, scratched her on the nose, and split her lip. Afterward, Rakie, who was also there at the police station, would leave with his aunt to go home. Then a month later, on November 26, Barbara went to the juvenile court building and signed a petition that charged her son with simple assault. But Rakie's subpoena was never delivered, receiving back a message stating unable to serve due to the weather.
Never concentrate, hesitate or debate. It's a brand new show, it's called For Kids' Sake. It's a new program coming on TV, and it's just not for one, but for the family. Everybody is watching.
The year 1987 in Richmond makes the list as just one of the worst years for the city far as murder, assault, robbery, and rape.
Frightened South Richmond resident. The fear is caused by two recent home break-ins that resulted in similar strangulation murders of two women.
The man in his early 20s had been shot in the head.
The fear has resulted in a dramatic surge in Southside calls to 911.
We'll have the latest in the death of a Richmond woman after police raided her home looking for drugs.
We're going to other news. There was another murder in the area.
Out on Southside streets, the police continue to watch for the murderer who has filled this area with panic.
But like anything that required a major component to thrive, our small hometown was no different, because the streets needed the dope being shipped across the border, or the endless supply of cocaine being trafficked down the I-95 highway. So a major influx of drugs of all kinds would act as the main catalyst that made the 80s what they were. And as we've covered in previous Richmond-based true crime stories, the oppression of the past created the struggle of the future. The older guys who hustled seemed less prone to violence, while describing the younger ones as dangerous and unpredictable. The same was said for our parents. Difference is, it was imperative that a man have a code back then.
So hurry up and tune in, but don't be late so you can watch the new show. It's called For Kids' Sake. Say.
In the beginning of '87 can be considered a sneak peek into what was to come later in that year, because just 10 days in, 6 people were already murdered throughout the city, and among those 6 victims was a man who had close ties with Eugene Johnson named Dale Montague, whose address claimed 213 East 11th Street. He was shot dead on January 8th at about 1 in the morning outside the Ebony Island nightclub. Another member or associate of the Johnson Brown gang who Rakie did his own business with. There's no indication on when Rakie started selling drugs, just that Dale Montague was one of his suppliers. And Dale's known street ties caused officers to neglect certain details, like the possibility of his death being connected to another well-known street guy named Ronald Jordan, who lived on 206 South Colonel Avenue. He was also murdered just 2 days after on the 1800 block of Lynn Haven Avenue. After a brief background of Ronald Jordan, it's found that he had a reputation as a killer for a large faction of drug dealers operating in Richmond. It's speculated that he ran with the Johnson and Brown gang, but no clear facts. To officers, Jordan was a main figure in homicide and drug investigations for a long time. He was charged with murder several years ago, but was set free after an acquittal, only to find out years later he was a suspect in several other murders, and that marks down Dale Montague and Ronald Jordan as the 5th and 6th victims of this war. So with officers only deeming them as casualties of an ongoing war, they just knew both events were isolated. But it raised a lot of questions when they'd find out later that both men were killed by the same person. That person being Kevin Tyree McFall, a 19-year-old man from Fairfield, specifically the 2100 block of Fairfield Avenue, which was located on the east end of the city. But detectives in the moment had no idea who killed either man just yet. So off the back of these 2 murders, along with tips from the police informants, it would lead narcotics and homicide detectives to raid 2 houses, stop 2 vehicles, in the same night of Ronald's murder. Houses that wouldn't be too far from where his body was found. Now, it wasn't immediate, but it didn't take long to find the 2 known dope spots on the Southside, in the area that us from Richmond, we call the Bottom. And it wasn't by chance that they'd run into Kevin McFall himself during the raid. One of the houses targeted for the raid sat on the 2400 block of Hardwood Street, and the other on the 1500 block of Columbia Street, both of which was ran and operated by a man we've already introduced in a past story named Douglas Dodson Jr., aka Becky. The raids were the city's attempt to stopping the drug war, or at least slow it down. After police arrested 7 people, they stumbled upon a weapons cache of semi-automatic rifles. Several of the weapons were loaded with Teflon-coated bullets which can penetrate vests. Detectives would say it seemed as if they were gearing up for war, or it just confirmed that they were the ones fighting it already. And among those who was charged was Becky's 46-year-old father, Douglas Dodson Sr., and 21-year-old Becky himself. Now, as they take everyone out in cuffs, they still don't know that their prime suspect in these past 2 murders were cuffed inside of that squad car. But the truth wouldn't stay buried for long, and this wouldn't be the last that we hear from Kevin Tyree McFall. A little over 3 weeks later, Rakie's mother attended a hearing on January 28th of '87, when Barbara would tell Judge Ruby that her son was using drugs, that his supplier Dale Montague was recently killed at the Ebony Island Club 20 days earlier, and that Rakie was now carrying a gun. Judge Ruby then issued a warrant ordering that Rakie be brought to him, with the words underlined in red: "Subject has firearm and should be placed in child detention home." But that warrant, it was never served, so it was thrown inside the drawer along with hundreds of other juveniles, not to mention the additional 20,000 of those alone for adults waiting to be served, either by an officer who has the time to serve them, or if an officer just so happens to run across them in the streets. Now, during this time, Barbara saw very little of her son, so getting in contact with mom would be a waste of time. It all boiled down to a probation counselor handling the matter, not even noticing that Rakie hadn't been brought to court for 6 months. Detective Woody would say he would gladly serve the warrant if he had even known that it existed. And this all makes the point that the justice system back then was nowhere near as sophisticated as it is now. So moving on into the month of February, we follow a case associated with a friend of Eugene's, and that being a guy named Andre Harris. We introduced Andre briefly earlier in the story after Eugene's attempt on Daniel Flax's life. During Eugene's trial against the Flax family, Andre was one of the guys who testified on Eugene's behalf. Now 3 to 4 years later, Andre has another potential case involving the death of a 23-year-old Donald Thagard. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right, so my apologies if I'm not. Thagard, who liked Andre, who was said to be a drug dealer. But there were two big differences about Donald, and one was him being a married white man from Henrico, and the second, he didn't adhere to the street code of ethics, stemming from a Richmond lawyer named J. Maury Hooker II, a man who cleaned a lot of dirty money for several drug dealers during that time, including Donald Wayne Thagard himself. Maury Hooker II was a former Henrico County prosecutor and a member of a prominent Virginia legal family. His father being a former Richmond Circuit judge, his grandfather was a congressman and longtime chairman of the state Democratic Party, both playing important roles in the legal system. So you could say success for Hooker's future was set in stone the moment he was born. But with no motive to give, we may never know why, but there were several ideas on what happened. This all begins a few years back with Donald Thagard and his business partner, Michael T. Miller. The two men led a drug ring that moved upwards to 40 pounds of cocaine from Florida since the year of '84. To his family, Donald came off as a loving, happy-go-lucky husband who would, out the blue, buy them expensive gifts for the sake of it being another Tuesday. But the negative side of Donald was his drug addiction to Tussinex, which was a cold and flu cough syrup, a drug that's used now today by a lot of entertainers in the music industry. So as time moves on, Donald meets the lawyer, Maury Hooker, who actually tried helping Donald and Michael with their drug business. Maury Hooker would launder over $200,000 in drug money, moving around assets through numerous bank accounts at a time, and even taught Donald and Michael how to avoid being caught. But the feds were already closing in. And unbeknownst to Maury, they'd have a conversation in the presence of an undercover drug police wearing a wire, which would be the nail in everyone's coffin involved. Now, in the face of doing 20-40 years, Donald Thagard takes the stand against the crooked lawyer who once kept $100,000 in cash inside of a shoebox for him. During the first day of his trial, they play back the conversation Maury had with a few guys from the organization. He was heard suggesting that Donald Thagard could implicate his partner Michael Miller, saying that Donald would testify against the others in a heartbeat. Then ironically, both Donald and Michael would end up testifying at his trial. It gets to a point where Maury's demeanor on one of the tapes indicated that he had repeatedly suggested or agreed that Donald should be killed. Maury would say, and I quote,
"If it happens, it happens. If anything happens to Donald, then I don't want to know about it, and you don't want to know about it either."
Now, in most cases such as this, the plausible reason for a drug dealer to turn state's witness would be to duck a charge of its own. But no matter the reason, Donald had broken the rules upheld by the same streets he did business in. Yes, Donald did more than run product from different states. He also did business with another man named Lucius Junius White, and this business associate would have ties with a few big names in the streets who allegedly were running things in Churchill at the time, guys that Lucius would soon introduce Donald to, all in the effort to gain more clientele. But not long after the case was broadcasted high and low throughout the city, Donald was unknowingly walking around with the $15,000 bounty on his head. On February 9, 1987, Lucius White would pay Donald Thagard a visit, and this comes after meeting with the guys from Churchill. Apparently, Donald either didn't care or thought because he ratted out a crooked lawyer instead of a real street guy, he'd be given a pass. But his associates from Churchill were worried that he would soon turn them in too. Understanding the assignment, there Lucius was, standing inside Donald's living room while he slept. Donald had methamphetamines, cough syrup, and morphine in his system, so he wouldn't be awake anytime soon. And allegedly, Andre Harris was said to be along for the ride. Donald was then shot through the temple, the bullet passing and exiting through his shoulder. They would take a bracelet and diamond ring that he was wearing, and after leaving the scene, it only took a day for Lucius to try and pawn what he stole, which would later down the line get him tore off. Donald's body wouldn't be found until the next day by his wife, saying everything seemed normal as her husband looked as if he fell asleep watching TV. But on a sofa to one side of his body was a shell from the 9mm handgun that killed him, marking him down as victim number 7 amid this war. Even in court, Lucius' lawyer would say it had to be the most peaceful scene he laid eyes on, but maybe too peaceful, making the case for his client Lucius White that the defense was left in the dark about a supposed letter written by Andre Harris from a Chesterfield County jail cell. It was a month after Donald's murder in March that Andre allegedly had a 17-year-old boy killed in front of Mosby Court Projects over some money that he owed, and that body eventually got him arrested. So while sitting in county jail, he felt the need to possibly get his friend Lucius off the hook. by confessing to being the actual trigger man. But the discrepancies between the two were damning, because an inmate in Henrico County Jail testified that Lucius told him he had killed Donald for $15,000, saying, and I quote, "Yeah, I off the white son of a bitch." And the inmate who told on Lucius was 32-year-old Hayden Mitchell, further telling him that the money came from the same Churchill boys who feared that he might testify against them. So why did Andre confess? Was he pressured? Or felt because he had a sentence coming anyway, why not take the charge for his homie? Well, we found out somewhat of a motive when Andre found himself stabbed to death 4 years later in '91 after being shipped to Buckingham State Prison. So to recap, the only one who saw the best outcome was the crooked lawyer Maury Hooker II himself. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison, but only did 18 months before his early release. Lucius received 76 years in prison, even with Andre's confession, but it was reduced to only 20 years a few months later. Andre received a life sentence for the murder of Sylvester Baker, and Donald, as we know, would lose his life before his sentence was passed down. Therefore, nobody really won this one. They all just lost a little slower. I don't want to take you off the story's course, but we're still in the year of 1987 with Rakie Cloyd, the young man who only spoke when necessary, aloof as they would say. He and Leonidas Brown, who also went by Lily, were somewhat alike and very close, and neither wanted the type of attention that most guys cried out for. Even if they were shooting the shit with the fellas, they stood alone amongst the crowd. By now, Rakie was Eugene's top earner, bringing in $30,000 a week alone. He drove a rust-colored 77 Coupe de Ville with a chocolate brown rag top with some Krager 30-spoke trues. And though he had a short stature, he leaned so far back while driving, you could only see his head in the rear side window. Rakie was a true loner, and among everyone in the Johnson and Brown circle, people had a tremendous fear for Carlton Brown. But Rakie was feared even more, and he would reinforce that fear 10 days later after Andre Harris helped put another snitch in the graveyard. Valentine's Day had just passed a week ago, but Richmond wasn't a place of sentiment for too long. A 20-year-old man by the name of Herbert Cunningham was on 101 East 12th Street in the Blackwell area when Rakie Cloyd allegedly paid him a visit. No word of an altercation gone bad, a devious motive, or even a call of duty by a higher power in his life. There were only gunshots, a heavy amount of gunshots leaving the chamber of a Uzi machine gun, which Rakie would use to gun Herbert Cunningham down behind one of Blackwell's housing projects. When the news broke, articles named Herbert the city's 18th homicide victim, but in terms of this war, he would be marked down as number 8, and for Rakie himself, this counts in total as body number 2. Now, months later, Rakie would be charged with the murder, but the charges filed against him was eventually dismissed. And this was only after a key witness didn't show up for court. But not only did he miss the court hearing, officials would say that they had never seen him again after their last conversation. Until this day, no one still has heard from this witness.
Call me, D.
Yeah, these the realest words I was spit on wax. Boog in the hood, I crawl through the crevices and I slip through the cracks. I live through the earls of the browns and flax. Live through the earls of the main, the range, Rakies and the Marcanes.